Fitzgerald.
Are we being recorded now? Could they'll hear us
Hope so.
chatting
This is good
nonsense?
B-roll. This is good B-roll stuff. Like the blooper reel.
But they should do that more at conferences.
Totally.
Like here's
Oh god, the B-roll like pre and post.
yeah, we're doing all right. Oh my god.
Great.
Sure.
Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to today's program with the editors and contributors to F. Scott Fitzgerald, A Composite Biography. I'm Elaine Hopkins, a little bit out of breath from moving chairs, the Senior Director of Programs and Services for the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, which is the Library of Congress designated Minnesota Center for the Book. So as such, we present programming that reaches all corners of our state and celebrates our state's literary legacy, libraries, and reading. So since 2020, we also are stewards of Fitzgerald in St. Paul, which presents programming that delves into Fitzgerald's work and connections to St. Paul. These roles provide the context for Gatsby at 100, revisiting Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. So this will be a year of programs marking the milestone 100th anniversary of the publication of the novel. The Friends will convene a variety of programs that invite us to revisit the book and consider how its themes apply today. These programs include exhibits, theatrical presentations, a live reading of the entire novel, and more. So please do pick up one of these lovely calendars, and you can also visit thefriends.org/Gatsby to find out more information on all the upcoming programs. So I'd like to recognize and thank our series partners, the St. Paul Public Library, the Minnesota Historical Society, the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, and, especially relevant today, the University of Minnesota Press. Today's program was made possible in part by the people of Minnesota through a grant funded through an appropriation to the Minnesota Historical Society from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Any views, findings, opinions, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the authors and editors and do not necessarily represent those of the state of Minnesota, the Minnesota Historical Society, or the Minnesota Historic Resources Advisory Committee, just so we all know. I would like to thank Steve Brunsberg at SPNN and the whole team who are making the live stream and recording of today's program possible. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here today, those who are in person and those who are viewing from, well, we don't know how many people are viewing online or where they're from, but there are many, many people viewing online as well. So thank you all for being a part of this kickoff to Gatsby at 100. So now I'm going to hand things over to Eric Anderson, the Senior Acquisitions Editor at the University of Minnesota Press.
Thanks, Elaine. I'm sorry, I went the wrong way there. Thanks for coming out on this brisk, kind of classically Minnesota day. We're really grateful. It's always good when you get to an event and it's like, oh, it's kind of tough to park. That means there's a lot of people here, so that's fantastic. I'm just going to be really brief because obviously I'm as excited as you all to listen to this great panel of people. I just want to say thank you on behalf of the University of Minnesota Press. We've been a press also for 100 years. This is our 100th year. We were founded in 1925. We've been publishing about the region, publishing about our state, publishing about the people and the places that we call home for a very long time. I think, we've come a long way too. I think one of our earliest books was called Prunes or Pancakes. It was a book by the Star Tribune food critic, and maybe it was a nutritional book / cookbook, but I don't know if you can find it. I'm sure it's a classic. But I'm really grateful that you're all here as well for this. It was an incredible joy to work with Niklas and David on this book. I really appreciated the care that they took, the spirit in which they undertook this incredible idea, to kind of follow from this notion, and as Fitzgerald himself wrote about how hard it is, I'm going to butcher the phrase directly, but that it's hard to write a good biography because a good writer is many people at once. They could tell you exactly how he said it with much more aplomb than me. And then I also just want to acknowledge, too, that role that Scott Donaldson, who I'm sure, they will talk more about, played in this. I was very lucky to get to work with Scott on the edition of Fool for Love and paperback, and so I know that his spirit and his kind of vision towards kind of bringing 23 esteemed kind of writers and thinkers and critics about Fitzgerald and his life and the world around Fitzgerald. We're so grateful that Ross and Dave are here as well, and you'll get full introductions of this great panel from Wendy soon, but it's just a book that I'm we're very, very proud of. It's wonderful to get to celebrate it here in this year of our 100th as well. And again, just Niklas, David, thank you so much for your work and for your vision and everything that you did to bring this beautiful book to bear. Thank you to the Friends for your support directly of this book, as well as everything you do for publishers like us in the region, for publishers all around this state as well. It's incredible to have such a devoted, smart, passionate, and also frankly incredibly kind group of people that work on behalf of readers and writers and thinkers in this state. So for us to be a part of that community is a real gift. So I'm going to get out of the way. Thank you again to this incredible group. I'm excited for you to listen. And Wendy Worden, I'm going to pass it over to her.
Make the no squealing, good. Okay. Hi, I'm the Programs and Services Coordinator at the Friends. I work hand in hand with Elaine on getting this Gatsby at 100 extravaganza together this year, and I'm very excited to introduce you to our panelists, and I swear I'm the last person who is not the panelists to be speaking. So, we have David Rennie, one of the editors. Rennie has a PhD in American literature from Aberdeen University, where he worked as a researcher and academic writing skills advisor. He is now teacher of English at St. Macar Academy, which is literally across the road from his alma mater. His essays have appeared in the Hemingway Review, the F. Scott Fitzgerald Review, the Cambridge History of American Literature and Culture in the Great War, and his books include American Writers of World War I, Sir Alexander Ogston, A Life at Medical and Military Front Lines, that sounds fascinating, and Scottish Literature and World War I. Our second editor is Niklas Salmose. Dr. Salmose holds a PhD in English from the University of Edinburgh and was a visiting professor at UCLA in the autumn of 2018. He's been here several times for Fitzgerald-related things. He is currently vice chair in the Department of Languages at Linnaeus University, Sweden. And Salmose has published and presented internationally on nostalgia, Nordic noir, Hitchcock, cinematic style in fiction, modernism, the Anthropocene and Hollywood, animal horror. This is fantastic. I swear I read this before, but it's great. Intermediate and sensorial aesthetics in fiction. Our slightly more local friends are Ross Tangedal and David Page. Ross Tangedal is an associate professor of English and director of the Cornerstone Press at UW-Stevens Point. He specializes in American print and publishing culture with emphasis in book history, textual editing, bibliography and authorship, American writers Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, and the American Midwest. He is also the director of the Center for Bibliography and Textual Research and the publisher of the Midwest Review. And David Page is a retired writing instructor at Inver Hills Community College and has worked on 5 books on Fitzgerald, including F. Scott Fitzgerald in Minnesota, The Writer and His Friends at Home, which we actually have copies of in the back if you need one, The Thought Book of F. Scott Fitzgerald, and he has helped organize 2 international F. Scott Fitzgerald conferences here in St. Paul, and has made several videos alongside his wife, Mecca, for us at the Friends on Scott's history in Minnesota. So now I will hand it over to these delightful humans. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all 3. It's great to be in St. Paul on a very crisp day, using Fitzgerald's words. Before I forget, there are a few people I'd like to thank in particular, or we all would like to thank, at least the editors. So certainly Eric Anderson at University of Minnesota Press, who has been a tremendous support throughout the process of actually editing and writing this particular book. His colleague Emma Sachs, and without her help, we still would be working with permits for illustrations for the book, I'm sure. Heather Skinner, too, at the University of Minnesota Press, and we had a fabulous copy editor named Kathy Delfoss. Obviously also Wendy, Friends of St. Paul, that made some of these illustrations possible in the book because a lot of assistance. here, Mel Barker and Stu Wilson, which knew about this project from the very beginning and put us in touch both with the University of Minnesota Press and the Friends of St. Paul. So a special thank you to you for being with us all these years, never giving up. And of course, all the contributors to the chapters of the book. So the setup here is I will talk a little bit about passion. And then we go into the nature of the composite biography, and then we will have a dialogue with Dave and Ross. And then we will open up the floor for questions. But I want to mention passion because it is because of passion, passion in curating the works and the lives of F. Scott Fitzgerald that we are actually constantly drawn and returning to his life and his work. It reminds me of what Helen Turner's mother told her. She's the contributor of the first chapter of the Composite Biography. Her mother said, "Will you ever leave that poor man alone?" And no, we will not, because he truly fascinates us constantly in different contexts and in different ways. And his work is being reevaluated, and there's new things coming up, and we find out new things. And so the reason why he is so much alive is, of course, the passion of all the curators. And my own passion for Fitzgerald, like so many others, I suppose, stems from a high school experience of this novel. And I had a fantastic and rather eccentric English teacher in high school called Paul Goodnature. He was the teacher of the year of Minnesota 1987, and I came to stay with him as an exchange student in 88, 89. And during his humanities classes, we went through fantastic American literature, but the one that stuck the most was The Great Gatsby, and the way that he unpacked this novel for a 15-year-old kid in a way that made it very comprehensible and universal. And I remember you might remember, I have 3 high school friends visiting here today too, so it's great. You remember that we painted a yellow car on the wall in his classroom and drenched it with a lot of red blood? So, I mean, there were all these extracurricular activities that just made these stand out in different ways. So I think it all starts somewhere. Like it's a lot about teaching, but it's curating in general. We do it on different levels and in different contexts. And it is this particular passion for Fitzgerald and his works that makes him still very much active and alive, I think. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the history of how this project actually started. And paradoxically, it started at the 2018 Hemingway conference in Paris. So we became so good friends in the Fitzgerald Society that we wanted to meet more often than biannually through our Fitzgerald conferences. So we started to hijack the Hemingway conferences too, which are in the other years. Of course, David is a recovering Hemingway scholar, but I went there only for the ride, basically. And it was an extremely hot summer in Paris in 2018. And we had all suffered through a tremendously horribly poor keynote by Terry Eagleton, where he only mentioned Hemingway once. That was his final word of his 60-minute keynote. He mostly sang Irish songs, as far as I can remember. So we were completely exhausted, and we said we have to go out to a cafe, and we ordered some rosé wine. And we started to talk about this whole idea of literary biography, and we had both David and I had read Scott Donaldson's The Impossible Craft, I mean, the challenges of writing literary biography, and talking about how these biographies are constantly sort of, they have either a particular premise that they want to prove or show, a case to drive, or they had a special subjective relationship to Fitzgerald, and all these things in relationship that you have only a certain amount of space, and you will focus on the similar important events of his life that everybody else does. It doesn't give you a sense of the depth and the multi-layered composition of a persona that Fitzgerald and his work actually entail. So we were thinking about that this is, in many ways, a deficiency in biographical writing, and how can you get by that? You know, of course, you can read all the biographies and you somehow put your own layer on top of them and create your own biographical narrative. But we were thinking, what about if we would approach this in a little bit more cubist kind of style, thinking about what happens if we invite a lot of different participants to consider and think his life in different ways. So that was the start, and then we started to think that we should do this in 2-year windows. And on the boat, on the conference dinner in the Seine, after a biblical rain, so everybody was totally wet and freezing to death, in air-conditioned boat, you know, we went up to Jack Sombrier, who is the president of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society and one of the great Fitzgerald scholars. And we asked him if he wanted to be on this project. And he said, Niklas, I cannot say no to you, ever. So we asked which year would he like to cover, and he wanted to cover the final year of Fitzgerald's life. And that's when it started to roll. Then I hand over to David, now my co-editor, to talk a little bit about the sort of the principles of the composite biography.
Thank you, Niklas. The attraction, I think, of having lots of different people involved was, other than the pleasure of working with our friends and our colleagues, would give us an opportunity to move beyond the inherent subjectivity of a single author biography. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that if you are putting forward an idea that's hopefully new or helpful, that will help understand an author's life. It has to be sustained coherently across an entire book. But we've got, I think, 30 plus biographies of Fitzgerald, and they all put forward some slight bias or methodological focus. Matthew Bruckley, for example, the classic, some sort of epic grandeur, tends to be very factual, provides clear information, focuses on authorship a lot, the amount of books that Fitzgerald sold, how much money they made. More recently, David Brown, in 2017, he treats Fitzgerald as a cultural historian, someone that's very sensitive about the social and intellectual developments as America transforms from a rural, agrarian country into an urban and more industrialized one. Another example that springs to mind is Jonathan Bates's parallel life of John Keats and F. Scott Fitzgerald, and he puts forward the idea that Keats was a huge and consistent influence on Fitzgerald. So these are wonderful books, they're very valuable, but the existence of more than 30 of them seems to suggest that the single author approach is missing something, or that it's not going to be definitive. Maybe it can't be definitive. So then that suggested to us, like Niklas says, if there's going to be a new book and people are going to be asked to give up their time and money to read it, we need to offer something a bit different. So Fitzgerald himself, as Eric was alluding to earlier, wrote down something about biography that helped us move to the next stage. He said, "There never was a good biography of a novelist. There couldn't be. He's too many people if he's any good." Now, what does that mean? Well, perhaps Fitzgerald means that as a literary creator, a writer has to project themselves imaginatively into the lives of their fictional creations. I also read in it the idea that we're all different people to each other. And I imagine that Scott was a very different person in his mother's eyes than he was, let's say, from Ring Lardner's perspective. And of course, those relationships change and evolve over time. So, combining multiple contributors in one volume allowed us to, on the one hand, say there are limitations in biography and we're not attempting to be definitive, but at the same time, it might be a more accurate or effective way of representing the many different people Fitzgerald felt himself to be. And so we divided Fitzgerald's life into 2-year windows, and we were doing this with a view to giving each contributor enough space to develop their ideas in a context to a reasonable degree, but also to leave room for multiple authors to participate. And well, the biography itself doesn't want to put forward a single interpretive narrative. All our contributors did. They all went with something that was kind of interest to them personally. Dave Page and Sarah Kasiba talk a lot about the Midwest. Ross touches on authorship. I wrote about golf. Just because I like golf and I wanted to see what would happen. So there's a sense that, well, this is a biography that's also an exercise in biography for us. All scholarship tends to be biographical. It reflects the ongoing interests and preoccupations of each individual. But we hope you think it's a good one, although Fitzgerald doesn't seem to think that's possible, and one that hopefully puts forward a somewhat new format for biography that gets closer to the idea of what Fitzgerald felt was required as far as that goes. And since we're in St. Paul, I think there's no better place to move to next than to Dave Page, who knows more about Fitzgerald and St. Paul than anyone else.
I'm not sure that's true. I do want to tell a brief story, and you kind of have to wait to the end for the punchline, so be a little patient. It's not very long. But there's that scene at the end of Great Gatsby, a very famous scene where he's waiting for the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad, and he says that his friends are there waiting to go back to St. Paul at Christmas, and they're talking about parties that are going to take place at the Ordways, the Herseys, and the Schultzes. And those were real families in St. Paul. You all know the Ordways, and the Herseys were lumber. The Schultzes a little less known, and also Fitzgerald misspelled their name. He added a T, which I would have done, so I don't really blame him. They had no T. And Schultz was the president of a wholesale shoe company and lived in this wonderful mansion just across the street from the St. Paul Cathedral. There's a picture of it in my book, and if you want to see a picture of the home before it was torn down, the last great mansion to be torn down in St. Paul in 1959. Anyway, Schultz's daughter, Kitty, was a great friend of Fitzgerald, and she was in my chapter of the Composite Biography because he met her when he moved back to St. Paul in 1908. And Kitty and her older sister volunteered at a Red Cross Institute for Disabled Soldiers in New York City. And it was funded by a guy by the name of Jeremiah Milbank. And Fortune magazine said the Milbanks were one of the oldest, richest, most proper, and least publicized families of the American business community. Jeremiah's grandfather, also called Jeremiah Milbank, bought into a condensed milk company called Borden's. And they just ran with that, of course, and made millions of dollars. Jeremiah ended up marrying Kitty's sister and then Margaret. Margaret passed away, which of course drove me insane when I was trying to do the research, because I was thinking, I thought he was married to Kitty, but he's married to her sister. Well, yeah, he was married to both. One passed away, he married Kitty. And he invested in the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad, which shows up at the end of Gatsby. He also was director of the Southern Railway, Chase Manhattan Bank, Alice Chalmers, Western Union, American Express, and other companies. Once again, this is a guy from one of the richest families in the United States that you've never heard of. He and Kitty socialized with the likes of President Hoover, Charles Lindbergh, and Morrill Lindbergh. These were the people that they ran around with. And his money, Jeremiah Milbank's money, was used to start the Heritage Foundation, which of course financed Project 2025. If you don't know anything about that, you're in good company, neither does the future president. So he was one of the most influential conservatives in the United States. So here's the point of what I hope was a brief story. In 1965, Kitty self-publishes a memoir, and it's called Miscellanea. It's published in 1965. So this woman who, this was her life, this is how she started the book. I remember Scott Fitzgerald.
Good job, Dave.
That's an amazing story. I think I'll ask this question to both of you, Ross and Dave, on a more general note. What were the challenges and opportunities when you were offered to cover a 2-year window of Fitzgerald's life and work?
Me? Okay. So, much like Niklas said that Jack Breyer doesn't say no to Niklas, I also don't say no to Dave Rennie, who's been my friend now for almost 10 years, and getting to know Niklas. We're in good company. So, of course, they gave me the prime period, 1904 to 1905. Where, you ask? Buffalo, New York. Of course, you all know lots about Buffalo. You also know lots about Fitzgerald as an 8-year-old in Buffalo. So the challenge would be the entire thing was a challenge. But you don't say no to your friends. You say yes, and you put your head down, you get after it. So the only thing I thought of initially was, what would he have seen when he walked outside? Okay, he's 8. So his father worked for Procter & Gamble in Buffalo, so it's an office area. So therefore, he may have spent some time, in downtown Buffalo, whether or not he was around his father. I kind of merged in a bit about his father's failures, because that was really important to Fitzgerald early in his life, that his father was a professional failure. And I think that failure kind of stuck to Fitzgerald for most of his life, up until the end of his life. He had kind of an interesting relationship with failure, considering now that we're celebrating him and his great novel 100 years after its release. Remember that The Great Gatsby was not a success upon release. And then that took me down the road of just architecture in Buffalo, because Buffalo, if you know anything about Buffalo, has such an interesting architectural history. It became kind of a strange laboratory for a lot of different styles of architecture in the early 20th century, the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And then I found that Frank Lloyd Wright, the great Frank Lloyd Wright, developed the Larkin Administration Building, which was for the Larkin Soap Company, they were soap slingers. They sold soap door to door. And so much money was coming into the Larkin Soap Company, literally in barrels. So they had to put their money in barrels. There were barrels of money coming into the Larkin Soap Company. They needed a big complex, a huge administrative complex. And they enlisted Frank Lloyd Wright to build the Larkin Administration Building. And I thought, well, Frank Lloyd Wright makes for a pretty easy metaphor for structure, right? Because of, not just as an architect, but as a great architect who shared a hometown, by the way, with Ernest Hemingway, Oak Park, Illinois. So going from there, and knowing, and there was a confidence too with the structure that you could stay in your lane. I didn't have to think about what's going to happen in the 30s with Tender is the Night. Where am I going to trace this to the crack-up essays? How can I make this relate back to This Side of Paradise? None of that. You could stay in one space and let the editors kind of find the transitions between chapters. That's their job, because they're pulling together all of the disparate pieces to make one narrative. And so when it all came together, I ended up learning an awful lot about Buffalo architecture. about what, and then that leads you down the path of, well, what does Fitzgerald actually say about architecture in his own stories? And he's looking up at office buildings at the end of Winter Dreams in Manhattan when Dexter Green is mourning the loss of his girl. Or you think in the story The Sensible Thing, when George calls, when he becomes an architect, and there's a line that says, "Steel inexhaustible," right? Steel is something that lasts sort of for all time. And so the last part here is, it mattered to me very much, and this goes to the authorship question that David may ask me in a little bit. It mattered very much that Fitzgerald made things. He's a creator. In America, we make things. That matters. It matters that Frank Lloyd Wright made that building. It matters that F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote that book. That his Larkin Administration building is the Great Gatsby. His, Falling Water in Pennsylvania is Tender as the Night. His monuments, his architectural beauties are these physical objects that he had his name on. And so it was a great pleasure to get to work not only with your friends, but also to learn. I'm no architectural historian, far from it, and to get to learn about an area of the United States that I knew very little about, and then to spend some time trying to make some strands of influence stick without sort of overbearing the point. So, yeah, it was quite wonderful.
How about you, Dave?
Boy, I had exactly the opposite problem in my mind because I was worried that in trying to stay in my lane, I knew that there were places where I had to provide context. And I was always worried, because we never talked to each other, that I was desperate to think that we were all saying the same thing.
Yeah, right?
As far as the facts were concerned, I wasn't worried about the other stuff. But, when I was providing context, I thought, oh boy, I hope I'm not stepping on this person's toes and that we're not completely saying the opposite thing. So, and then the rest, I got to pick something that I knew a lot about. Kitty Schultz, for example, so that was easy.
I mean, we could say one thing, that we gave our authors very much freedom. We didn't direct them to say, you could pick this up or you should do that. And there was always a risk, of course, that they would be so incompatible as pieces that they wouldn't be able we wouldn't be able to thread them together as some kind of narrative continuity. Now, that didn't occur. There actually is a sense of progress. Of course, there are some overlaps too, but I don't mind them personally. I think they're usually sort of revising something from a slightly different perspective. So what we hoped for really was, by not giving too many directions, we also teased out a lot of new things, right?
Right. We're going to start talking about what's in the book now. Yes. 40 minutes in. So Ross, somewhat quickly, an abbreviated version. Your chapter has two main focuses, two main topics: authorship and architecture. So very briefly, what does authorship mean to you as a scholar who's active in that area, and what did it mean to Fitzgerald as someone who was not writing in 1904 and 05, but he was going to inherit the changes that were afoot then? What did that mean to him as an early writer?
Sure. This goes back to my idea that writers make things. There's a theory called the death of the author by Roland Barthes, and it's wrong. And I've taught that to my students. 3 of them are right there, by the way, and they've all heard this spiel at some point when they were at the university with me. Somebody has to write the thing that becomes the book. And in so doing, there are so many compromises that happen. There are so many questions that arise, relationships that happen with editors, with designers, with marketing people, with friends and colleagues. Authorship is sort of the complete public function of the personal writing task. So if one is to write, one can write without becoming a published author. But those two functions, the writer function and the author function, exist in the same person. And Fitzgerald, of course, would have become enamored, I argued in my Buffalo chapter, because Fitzgerald was a voracious reader, even at a very young age. His ledger suggests that he was reading several different types of books, whether they were quest books by H.G. Wells, or more children's literature, or even literature that was based out of Britain or England. He was reading about knights and King Arthur. He was reading a lot. And so in doing that, I suggest, again, I also have a sentence in my chapter that starts my authorship chunk that says the main problem with biographies is that a biographer tries to connect every single thing that an author ever did from birth to death to their genius. And that does a disservice to the subject. But that's the confines of a biography, is that, well, F. Scott Fitzgerald, he's a genius because when he was 5, you're like, well, no, that's silly. But it's that confine, though, that can bring you out into new avenues of possibility, right? And so if he's reading all of these things and seeing these writers on magazine covers, of course, at the turn of the century, the magazine industry in the United States was really booming, which Fitzgerald, of course, by the 1920s was taking full advantage of with the Saturday Evening Post and other magazines. And so he could see these people making something of themselves. And he wanted to do that. And so he did.
Oh, thank you, Ross. That was very elegant. You managed to combine authorship and architecture altogether. My follow-up to that would be, having spent a couple of days in St. Paul and being able to see for the first time buildings and addresses that we've known only through encountering them in print, how do you think that would have influenced a young Fitzgerald, growing up with a building with the epic grandeur, perhaps, of the James J. Hill House or the St. Paul Cathedral and the palatial homes on Summit Avenue? What did that, do you think, do to a very ambitious young person and what they wanted to achieve?
Well, and due to his father's failures, he reacted not as a failure, but as someone who would then strive with ambition to overcome those things. As we know, on Summit Avenue, he lived in a row house, right? And that was bankrolled primarily with his mother's money as opposed to his father. And there's something about that, too, that really mattered to Fitzgerald, right? And so seeing, if one thing in America, if Americans love to make, they also love to strive. We strive, right? We search. We seek more for ourselves always. And that's the Great Gatsby, of course, is the search for self and the making of oneself out of the sinews of our experience and of our troubles. And so he's doing that in St. Paul, he's doing that in Buffalo, and he's doing it in all over wherever he lived in the United States, in New Jersey for a while, and down in Montgomery, Alabama, in New York and London, everywhere that he lived, everywhere that he visited. It's the idea that Fitzgerald died striving to be something more than he was. And I don't think there's anything more American than that.
Thank you. Niklas, do you have some questions for Dave?
Sure. Dave covers 1908 to 09, so he covers the transition from the Buffalo years through that particular failure of his father into St. Paul. So it's mainly about his St. Paul years. And I'm thinking, it's since we're here, sort of generally, what were the influences of his St. Paul experiences in his actual writing?
Believe it or not, he wrote in the introduction to a book on Maryland architecture about his experiences in St. Paul with his father telling him Civil War stories. And that always kind of threw me off because I was thinking, really at 12? I mean, wouldn't Dad have been telling him the stories before then? But, that's where you don't know what to trust, if that's what Fitzgerald said. But the Civil War, based on stories his father told him, supposedly in St. Paul, had a huge influence on him, and he wrote specifically stories about the Civil War. The last story published in his lifetime was a story his father had told him about the Civil War. And then, of course, he used the Civil War as a metaphor in stories like Winter Dreams. And so that's one area, of course, that St. Paul had this kind of tangential influence on him as the first state to offer a regiment to fight for Lincoln. They weren't the first regiment to get there because it was hard to get from Minnesota to the battlefields, but we were the first state. And of course, James J. Hill and Summit Avenue had a huge influence on his desire to strive.
Right.
St. Paul has always had this weird relationship with Fitzgerald.
Right.
They didn't always kind of embrace him as they do today, and there's been plenty written by people through the years about how Fitzgerald was an interloper, and he was not part of the Summit Avenue Society, which is, in my mind, completely wrong. But at the same time, he was a little embarrassed by his mother and father. So when I was first doing research, I would ask people about Fitzgerald, and they would all say, oh yeah, he was a great friend, we all liked him, da 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 da. But I realized at some point I was asking the wrong question, and finally I was able to ask, and unfortunately most of them had already passed away, did your parents ever socialize with his parents?
There you go. Yep. There you go.
No.
Right.
So, so that was another influence so there was that balance.
Can I just chip in
Sure.
here? Like St. Paul Academy, where he went to school, was that the same thing there, or was that a privileged school, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it still is. I mean, St. Paul Academy is, a great educational private school in St. Paul still. And, he went to dance classes. I mean, you have to be a little higher than just kind of your normal middle-class person to go to dance classes. Mm-hmm. And he went to private schools. And he went on vacation at the Adirondacks. Mm-hmm. So this was not this poor boy that wasn't part of the Summit Avenue Society. And, I'm going to say again, this woman who led an incredible life, her first, I remember Scott Fitzgerald. So he was part of the society, but I think he always had that fear of slipping. So St. Paul did have, and then of course the Catholic Church. St. Paul was one of the few places in the United States where Catholics were not discriminated against. We're talking about the Town and Country Club. You could be a Catholic and a member of the Town and Country Club. And for you people who have no idea what I'm talking about, go back and look at your history. Catholics were not allowed at a lot of those places. In St. Paul, they had to be because James J. Hill married a Catholic.
You mentioned, you mentioned Kitty, but you also mentioned Violet Stockton and Evelyn Stewart Gerard in your chapter. I think giving them rather much space in that chapter is one of the more original contributions to. If you think about other biographies, I cannot not really mention them very much. That you also see that Broccoli and Andrew Turnbull, they actually get Violet Stockton entirely wrong for some reason. So, and you also in your thought book, you write a lot about girls and love, he writes a lot about love and girls. So these three girls then compared to Ginevra King and Zelda, how do they sort of emphasize his? What do they do to his literary career? Is he referring back to them? Is those kind of love stories something that has a tremendous effect on the way that he fictionalizes his life and he fictionalizes love and passion?
I mean, he definitely used them, but I think Ginevra was probably the one that stuck with him the most. So when you're 12 years old and you fall in love, it probably isn't as hard. And I suspect that the reason I was able to dig more into the lives of those people is that computers got better. So I got better as a researcher and was able to, find out things that, I mean, Violet came from this incredible family from New Jersey that owned, let me think, what's the college? They owned Princeton. And I don't know, but I suspect that she may have been one of the reasons why he wanted to go to Princeton. And she lived in Trenton, and if you look at his diary journal, the first thing he did when he went to Princeton is he went down to Trenton, supposedly to have a couple drinks, surprise, surprise, but I suspect that he was, going to visit Violet, and he ended up writing home about her younger sister. But I don't know how much it directly impacted his literature, except in some of the, the short stories he wrote about St. Paul. But I'm sure there was something about the passion that comes through in his love stories that grew as a part of all those young women that he fell in love with.
But that sense of romantic love certainly didn't come from his parents. So, I mean, why did he become such a romantic? I mean, you knew him, come on.
I think based on the women that he generally was attracted to, Kitty Schultz, Marie Hersey, these are all really, these are women of a status that he would have wanted. And I have no idea how many of them he asked to marry him, but I suspect it was a significant number. And they all said no. And for whatever reason. Even though he ran with that crowd, his family was not quite of the financial status that they were. And so I think to answer your question, I think he saw them as a path to get to a financial status that he may have thought he deserved.
Yeah.
Can I follow up by asking something that's been in my mind for the last couple of days? It ties in with Ross and his focus on architecture. If Fitzgerald was so desirous of status and perhaps made self-conscious about his relatively inferior status, living at 559 Summit Avenue on a street above the average and a house below the average, why did he never own a home?
Well, I mean, I had...
Beyond the obvious fact that he couldn't handle his money very well, why did he never make a concerted effort to save?
I had the pleasure of growing up in a stable household. I lived in the same farmhouse until I was 10, and then we moved to town, and then my parents still live in that house. So I don't have a personal connection to sort of the instability of what that type of lifestyle would be. I guess there's a connection to like being a military brat. You're always on the move. There's always a new place to set up a community or to set up a family. I think it's clear if you look at the Composite Biography that he lived in so many places because his parents lived in so many places. But also if he is doing this striving and back to Niklas's idea about passion and Zelda down in Alabama, there was always this notion that if he settled in, and you know what? The other person I study, Ernest Hemingway, also never lived in the same place for very long. They were always on the move. There was always this notion of being on the move. And I always thought that also they wanted to be seen as worldly. Well, certainly Hemingway did. But they wanted to be seen as worldly or cultured as well, that if I stayed in one place forever, how could I possibly know more about the world or the country? But even then, to own a home, feels very final. And I don't think Fitzgerald, if you look at the end of This Side of Paradise, I know myself, he cried, but that is all. And Jim West has recorrected the ending to have an M dash instead of a period. So that matters. Punctuation does matter, my friends. A period is the end of something. An M dash is the continuation of something. And there's this idea that Fitzgerald was always transitioning, he was always continuing, he was always moving, he was always going beyond, again, because he died wanting to be something more than he was. And the only way one does that is if one is always on the move.
And he uses ellipses much more than any other modern authors
Those
for that very reason.
transitions, right.
I'm thinking a little bit about sports. You say that Scott played baseball in June 1909. How do you know that?
Yeah, he wrote about it, but I think he was like, so this is at St. Paul Academy, where in his class there were probably 15 boys, and he was on the third string baseball team. So
There's no running out of people, yeah.
once again, I think it was, he understood what being a sportsman meant at that time, even at that time, I should say, that it was a way to status. Mm-hmm. So money was a way to status, sports were a way to status, and he had very little of the sports part and not enough of the money part, and figured out he could gain the status that he wanted through his amazing writing. So, that's...
But Niklas, you asked Dave, why was he such a romantic? But, he also wanted to be like the star fullback at Princeton, So, like, Fitzgerald, he knew how to, even in Buffalo, he knew how to talk to girls. That was one of his qualities, is he could talk to them and woo them, right? But then there was also this performance of masculinity that, more of a man is successful on the football field, or
Military career. His
and
military career.
Not getting over was also a ding to that masculinity. So there was this sense, and Hemingway brought it out in him too, the competitive nature of writing, the competition of writing, of bettering one's equals or trying to become better than one's rivals. It all plays into that same place.
I mean, David, in your chapter, you write about country clubs and golf, for example. So I'm sure you can unpack this sportsman's like ambition even more to us.
No.
And by that we invite questions.
Ellipsis. I think disappointingly for me, in one limited respect, Fitzgerald had an ambivalent participatory relationship with golf. He played sporadically. He was a member of a few clubs, but I don't think it was ever a site of heroic possibility for him. Not like lacked the drama of the football field. So going down that rather short and disappointing path when I was writing the chapter did help me realise that the country club itself was a far more fertile ground for discussion, because that's where the idea of social stratification, of being included or excluded, plays out significantly in his work. And you see that at the start of Beneath Bob's Her Hair, where the caddies are outside looking at the dance they can't enter. Dexter Green in Winter Dreams is excluded from the golf club himself as a caddy, but then later as a successful individual is allowed to play golf with the men he caddied for. And a lot of the youthful interactions of that time happened in country clubs, Lass of the Bells and Fitzgerald's own life, Ginevra King, and meeting Zelda. So not so much golf itself, but definitely the country club environment.
Right.
I'm thinking that what you all have mentioned here is this infamous idea of his double vision in different ways, right? And I think we also need to transform the idea of the double vision to his style of writing, because he's especially I would say in The Great Gatsby, which has this capacity of positioning us even today in that heat of the jazz era, but also distance us from those very experiences, which seems to be how he felt about girls, sport, military, everything, in the sense that he was there but not yet there, and that translates into his writing style. And to me personally, that is one of the greatnesses of his writing style, is that particular sort of airiness of being part and still not being part of something.
Well, and look at how messy This Side of Paradise is, and how messy and overlong The Beautiful and Damned is. These are good books. The Great Gatsby isn't like them, though. It's a self-conscious artistic choice to strip away so much of what he built his early career on, which was this high romanticism, high lyricism, with a more precise, like diamond edge to the glitter that he'd sprinkle on things. He never did it again. It's one of the most remarkable shifts in an author's style, because This Side of Paradise and The Beautiful and the Damned are not like The Great Gatsby. And Tender is the Night is another maturing, but it's also not like The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby is a singular achievement. And the fact that he was able to make that choice as an artist and craft that out of that experience, and then, of course, because he was hoping it would be a success, he would continue in that vein. And because it wasn't, that's why there's not another Great Gatsby, because there's a conscious choice that I have to keep shifting and evolving if I'm going to make something of myself. And I love that today we know him because of The Great Gatsby. When he died, the New York Times ran with jazz age writer of short stories. So it's a singular achievement. Damn it.
Well, Ross, that's a very elegant way to perhaps begin moving on from our biography to the wider series of events that will be taking place here to celebrate the centenary of the Great Gatsby. I thought it was me rustling there. I hope our session today has went some way towards foregrounding the merits of a multi-author autobiographical approach. But what being here for me and for Niklas as well, I think I can speak about him, has re-emphasised is that appreciation of literary lives is always a composite process. Mm-hmm. And it's all the more enjoyable for that reason. We could not have done this without Eric Anderson and his redoubtable colleagues at the press, or the Friends of St Paul Public Library, who generously supported this volume and this event. And we're very grateful to all the staff here today who have taken part and helped make this possible. And to the formidably well-informed Fitzgerald audience for being here on this very cold day, thank you as well. And to Ross and Dave as well. I'm very, very glad to share some time with you today. I also had a great day yesterday with Mel and Sue. They were very generous to Niklas and myself. We went to a women's ice hockey game. We are now Golden Gophers, yes, Gophers. And I got told how to spell Minnesota, I think, 28 times. So it's sunk in now. But it was a hugely enjoyable day, and what that serves as an excellent example for is the spirit of generosity in the Fitzgerald Society. I think what unites us all is that we're almost without exception more interested in our subject than ourselves, and it provides a very companionable forum for continuing the work of talking about Fitzgerald. So while it might be cold outside, there's been a lot of warmth in the interactions that we've benefited from today, and I think that makes Fitzgerald Studies not just a pleasant place to be, but a more productive one as well. So, given we do have some time left...
before we open up the floor, David,
well, okay, Niklas.
We should do some marketing for ourselves. You know, we talked about this last night at the bar. Remember?
Shameless self-promotion. Is there any other kind? No.
Well, go ahead, you do it.
Well, David and we have submitted a new manuscript to the University of Minnesota Press. It's currently under review, but let's see what happens. But
It's got quite an interesting name, which I think we got to first.
yeah,
I
we
can
got
prove
to
that
it
we
first.
got there
It's
first.
Gatsby at 100. It's the title of the.
I have this sketch on the back of a conference program that dates back to summer 2023.
Yeah, so it's a book where we assign each chapter of The Great Gatsby to a specific author to think about that chapter in a contemporary kind of way, contemporary critical kind of way, to try and tease out, unpack why The Great Gatsby is still such a current cultural phenomenon. So 9 chapters, no illustrations, just great texts. It might be coming out by University of Minnesota Press. Otherwise, email me. I'll send you a copy from my copy machine at my university. But, you know.
We look forward to coming back next year to answer your questions on that.
But anyway, like David said, it was absolutely magnificent for us 4 here to kick off the centennial celebrations here with the Friends and the Gatsby. So thank you all very much for attending. Thank you all online for attending. Thank you, Mom. Yeah, we open up the floor for questions.
We are still a bit jet lagged, so be gentle.
So you started by talking about passion, and I'm wondering if you could each say why you think there's so many authors of 100 years ago that are forgotten, great authors of 100 years ago that are forgotten. Even Minnesota authors like Sinclair Lewis seem to be fading. Why does Fitzgerald seem more relevant than ever? And both to you personally and broadly, why are we still concerned about this man?
Dave?
Yeah, personally, I am what Fitzgerald would have called Black Irish Catholic, and also fallen away as Fitzgerald was. And he wanted to marry the most beautiful girl in the world, and I did. Sitting right over here. So you see all we have in common. The only thing we don't have in common is The Great Gatsby. So I do, as I've studied him, I do feel a personal connection. And he was just, such a brilliant writer. Anybody who spends any time, with his prose is bound to be moved at some point.
Well, when you go to the bookstore, I imagine you all do this, and you grab The Great Gatsby. I imagine every one of you does this every time you go to the bookstore, and you read the last 2 pages of The Great Gatsby. Even if you don't get it, it's about you. It's about every single one of us. Not many writers can do that, can quite literally speak to you, because we all strive and we all fail and we all love and we all care and we all make mistakes and we're all terrible and we're all beautiful. And so few writers can actually encompass the prismatic nature that is the person. And somehow he was able to do that. And I can't quit him for that.
I think there are lots of themes in Fitzgerald that resonate today. The desire for money, power, beauty, but then also an equally intent focus on the costs of pursuing or achieving those things. And they're very much relevant now. But it's combining those thematic orientations with the prose, I think, like Ross says. You have modernists who've tried in all sorts of different ways to approximate cognition and subjective life. But then if Fitzgerald writes something like, there are all kinds of love in the world, but never the same love twice, well, then there's no more to be said. But then what you do have to do is think. And then immediately, the quality of that expression kind of hands it over to the reader. It makes it about them.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of you. I mean, it is style, it's the brilliance of his prose, but to me, I'm also drawn to the 1920s in general. I mean, the Jazz Age is such a, not only in the US, but in the Western world, it's such a fundamental period in human progress when you think about capitalism, late industrialism, the sacrifices that were being done then is what we pay for now in our climate crisis. He has such a fantastic ear for all these concerns, even though he doesn't spell them out explicitly. They're all there, and you can go back and you can listen to them, and you know these trends, and it's quite remarkable, actually. And as a translator of Fitzgerald, we get drawn into contexts like, James L.W. West III and his annotation project in the critical editions in Cambridge shows how there are all these universal aspects of his writing, but there are also these particular specific contexts that would have drawn in an audience in those days that would have known exactly what he was talking about, that is mostly lost to us if we don't have these kind of annotations. And I think that is fascinating. That is, to me, usually greatness is when you have locality and universality together.
Yeah. Timelessness.
While we are waiting for other questions, let me just say that online there was a question about that Kitty Schultz memoir. Is there a title, Dave, that you can share?
It's called Miscellanea.
It's called Book.
No,
I know. Book.
and it's Kitty Milbank. I mean, she was Kitty Schultz, but then she married Jeremiah Milbank, and so self-published in 1965. I'll sell you my copy for $1 million.
Drive a hard bargain, Dave.
Hi, thank you for coming. It was an interesting conversation. I appreciate your time with this. So we spoke a lot of Fitzgerald wanting to be maybe something that he wasn't, or striving to be maybe more than he was. At the end, was he happy with his career, or was there a feeling that he wanted to do more? Was there misgivings, or did he feel that he was successful?
He had, a lot of the biographers do talk about this. Brookley makes quite a bit out of it, too. He was writing what became The Last Tycoon, and at least according to Brookley, and a lot of the biographers, this was a period of new energy, that he was embarking upon something that would be successful. You see, what's funny about Fitzgerald is every book became his resurrection. Well, when I put out Tender as the Night, that's going to get me back. Well, when I put out The Last Tycoon, that's going to get me back. Here, the last letter he wrote to Max Perkins, he says, "Do you think This Side of Paradise still has a life?" I think it does. There was always that sense that the next thing, but again, isn't that distinctly American? That just around the corner will be my next great opportunity to be great. But I have to just keep going, and I've got to look around the corner. And so there was this sense, as opposed to him sort of dying penniless or unhappy or falling apart or failing, he had this renewed energy because of what became The Last Tycoon. So he is in this strange transition period between feeling a failure but also feeling a renewal, which again, I hate to sound repetitive, but that feels distinctly American.
A quote is just strayed into my memory. I don't know if I can remember it all perfectly, but towards the end of his life, he was writing to somebody, I think Max Perkins, and he said, "There's little now in American letters that doesn't in some way bear my stamp. In a small way, I was an original."
Yeah.
So I don't know if he was particularly content about the financial or personal state of his affairs towards the end of his life, but I think he knew enough that he'd done something imperishable.
Yeah, I mean, he quit his drinking for a while there in the end, and he had a good relationship and started to enjoy LA a little bit more. And I think, yeah, The Last Tycoon, but also the Pat Hobby stories, which are rarely talked about, they show some energy and dynamicity and happiness.
Right.
And so I think many biographers, they tend to popularize his life into tragedy entirely, and that's maybe related to your question there, that we kind of want to see, because we see that funeral, the empty funeral, the few, like in Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, you know, there's just a few witnesses and it's raining and it's the most horrible funeral home in the world, as the witnesses said. And it's like, of course, he didn't know anything about that, but we, when we read, we are affected emotionally by that image of failure, of tragedy.
Yeah.
But I totally agree with you. I think he was fairly optimistic.
He was. Yep.
Most of you apparently give Gatsby as part of your curriculum. Somebody who wants to read more Fitzgerald, what would each of you recommend that they read for their second book? Before Gatsby, after Gatsby? What would be the second step?
Read his short stories.
No, not.
Oh, you want a novel?
Not the short stories.
Well, that's too bad, 'cause you should.
I grew up on the short stories.
Oh, good. Well, I got to think about that now. It's always the short stories.
I was going short story as well.
I still really like This Side of Paradise.
It's fun.
It's got great lines in it. It, of course, has some problems with continuity. Just a few. But I really always enjoy coming back to that. I'm not sure why it hasn't held up as well with the critics, but maybe I'm reading the wrong critics. I don't know.
I would recommend his essays, actually, yeah, which I think are profound and interesting and engaging and beautifully written too. Start with My Lost City, perhaps. Yeah.
Echoes of the Jazz Age.
Echoes of the Jazz Age.
Yes,
Those two companion
really good.
pieces are really great.
And I love Author's House. Author's House is a short essay. He talks about authorship being you live in a house, and the house has a turret and a basement. And at one point, at just one small glittering point in his life, he was at the turret. Just once. And then he came back down the stairs. It's a great metaphor. Read Tender is the Night. It's a maturing, post-Depression Fitzgerald, Great Depression Fitzgerald. And so you get a distinct shift in focus, but you also get such wonderful experimentation. The nonlinearity of the storyline, which has become a subject of wonderful debate in Fitzgerald studies. It's always a good time to talk about that. And just, it's always good to see an artist moving beyond sort of themselves. They're trying something new. They're trying something different. And so to follow The Great Gatsby with, which many would argue his most maturing work is Tender is the Night. He was moving toward the next thing.
I would agree. Read Tender if you want to keep going in that vein. I think what you get in Tender that you don't with Gatsby is a more mature perspective on some of the passions and themes that animate it. The Gatsby's in pursuit of something that's ennobling in some ways, but then also deeply destructive, but it's abruptly cut off. What you get to see in Tender is the Night is the slow decline of someone living with those morals and ambitions.
Yep, good answer. Yep.
There's an online question. So jumping back to Gatsby, would any or all of you like to speak about your thoughts on Fitzgerald's choice to use Nick Carraway as the voice of The Great Gatsby?
Well, I simply reiterate what I said. That is the narrative way of creating this distance and presence, I think. So it's fundamental, I think. It would be an entirely different story if it would have been focalized in a different way.
If he takes that third person sort of omniscient narrator, very 19th century, sort of out of it, you get that all over Beautiful and Damned. You get that all over This Side of Paradise, his ability to comment on things, which is what makes those books fun and interesting. But also it's sort of somewhat distinctively sort of the 19th century tradition of stepping out of the narrative, commenting on the situation, and then stepping back into the narrative. That's sort of a traditional sort of move. But that first person narrator, you know, one, it's about trust. And you don't trust a first person narrator. And that's key. Because I've told my students this for 10 years. You can never really know another person. And the best way to get that way is to get a first person narrator. Take that, Dave.
No, I don't really have a great deal to add to it, but I think it's important that, again, to go back to this idea that it's got to be all in the reader's head. Fitzgerald's very good, exceptional at using, at his best, very few words in a fleeting approximation of very complicated ideas. So it's already bounced back to the reader. We're not laboriously trying to wonder what Henry James is saying about the curtains. But then... But then that makes it a more complicated and sophisticated book. Who can we trust? Can we trust... Or who has certainty over any kind of knowledge in that book? Does Gatsby know himself? Does Nick know himself? And so it makes it slightly more sophisticated and complicated because we're not just seeing characters going through self-deception and deception of others. We're complicit in our interpretation of the narrative because there's an even greater burden on ourselves to try and work out who we can and should trust.
And I thought too, to piggyback on David's answer, think about how do you get across as a writer a character's being both repelled by and deeply attracted to the same character? I mean, how else do you represent that dichotomy? It has to be in the complex workings of their own mind and of their own expression because they're fighting with that repellence and that attractiveness at the same exact time. And Nick Carraway says that. He was both attracted to Gatsby and repelled by him. And there's something so strong about that perspective that you can't get as strongly with the third person.
And if we want to be a little bit more technical, so what Fitzgerald is doing is that he's actually using a lot of free indirect discourse in order to get into the phenomenological emotional aspects of other characters than Nick Carraway. But he's doing this in such an elegant way that we don't always notice it, but we feel what Gatsby feels, although it is actually focalized by Nick Carraway. So the narration in The Great Gatsby might look deceivably easy or simple, but it's exceptionally complex.
Right.
As I get older, I forget a lot of stuff. And I re-looked at Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which, of course, is the first-person narration, and everybody would admit that Fitzgerald was influenced by. And I had completely forgotten that the Heart of Darkness ended with a lie of Marlowe telling Kurtz's fiancée that his last words were her name, when of course we all know, the horror. And that question just made me think again about the Gatsby kind of ends in a lie as well. So, and I know he took these ideas in from all these different writers, and it just kills me.
As a student of Ross's, I'm doomed to have editorial questions whenever I open any book. I'm really curious what your strategy was for divvying up the years among your contributors, if you had people arm wrestling to write about what they were most interested in, or how that process was.
Should we answer this honestly?
Yes.
Yes,
Let's say
please.
I was at the bottom of the list, so I got
I
what
knew
was left
that.
over.
Yeah,
I'm
I think,
okay
I
with
think
that.
we should be honest.
What we did was we sketched out 2-year units on the back of the Hemingway conference program, and we thought about who we'd like to ask. But you don't just go and ask whoever you, well, maybe you do, but you've got to ask the right people in the right order. Because if you're doing something like this, obviously you want a handful of exceptional top drawer scholars. And sometimes that you can do that strategically by once you've got a good stable full of scholars and you know that other people will be more likely to want to participate. But I think where possible we let people choose what they wanted to go for.
We went from seniority to juniority, and then we asked them what years they wanted. And in the end, there was 1904 and 5 left.
I think I was the last contributor. Yeah, and you know what? I had a lot of fun doing it.
I had probably about 4 choices. And how many chapters are there?
23.
Yeah, so that shows you where I was. I was about 19.
There are a lot of exceptionally experienced Fitzgerald scholars.
I know. No, I am not I was very, very happy to get the chapter I got.
Oh yeah, I honestly, not just to brown nose my friends, just to be in the same book with Scott Donaldson and Jim West, who's one of my mentors, and Kirk Kernut, and just such tremendous Jack Breyer. I mean, these people set up Fitzgerald scholarship for us to continue to work on Fitzgerald. So just to be in any vicinity of them is a wonderful, wonderful thing.
I think
We
we
can
might-
say one. Sorry,
Oh,
we can
no,
say
please
one
continue.
thing. We can say 2 things, obviously, but we can say not at the same time. But what I wanted to say is that we were also thinking, of course, about gender. We're thinking about geography. We wanted to have scholars not only from America but European scholars too. So there were of course quite a lot of considerations to take into account when we decided who we wanted to participate in this. But I don't think anybody said no.
No.
They died,
They
but
didn't.
they didn't say no.
Yeah, some may have passed away, but nobody said no.
Yeah, it was a long journey. But that does bring me back to what I wanted to say on a more serious note. Ross has been very very complimentary in saying he's pleased to be part of the book. We are pleased to be operating within a very rich tradition of Fitzgerald studies, and the book is dedicated to Scott Donaldson and Ronald Berman, who passed away before they could see the book into print. So we are standing on their gigantic shoulders, and it's a privilege to be able to continue in that very rich tradition of Fitzgerald studies, and we couldn't do it without them. And that, I think, again, comes back to the idea of it being a composite process.
I'd like to ask my colleagues what I hope is an easy question. Without the Fitzgerald Society and the Hemingway Society, do you think there would be a difference? So what comes first, the chicken or the egg kind of question? Obviously, the societies have a huge influence, but at the same time, there was a reason they were created. So do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah.
The relationship between the fact that there are these societies that keeps pumping up, and would it still be pumped up without them?
I'm serious, Dave. I was just talking to David about this before we went on. No, really. Just the fact that, a lot of us do though strive not to fall into hagiography, which is just hero worshiping people, which is not productive. That we don't have to sit here and tell you that everything that F. Scott Fitzgerald said and did was, he was a deity and we all need to worship him. I mean, that's not what this is about. The societies are designed to encourage the investigation into and the teaching of the work by these people. That means interrogating them. That means not being okay with everything they said or did or were. And being able to differentiate between hagiography, which is just hero worship, and the actual study and interrogation of these people, and frankly, the work they did. They are nobody without their work. We know them because of what they wrote. We may not know who they are if they didn't write the things they wrote. So I think the societies provide an immense support system for the generation of scholarship, and also, good mentors within the societies push us to publish things in places where people's eyes will see it, not just as some sort of insular thing, but as something more outward, right? To professionalize the trade, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, supportive, and also I think a great sense of community
100%.
in general that is very creative, productive, and stimulating. But I mean, that's not regarding all societies, I can assure you. The Virginia Woolf Society certainly is not as communal and productive as the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society, for example, for reasons that I don't think we should discuss now. But
You started it, Niklas.
so it's not automatically you create a society and voila, everything is fantastic. It takes a lot of efforts from senior scholars to build up that confidence, and that,
Yes.
in the Fitzgerald Society, I'm on the executive board, and we're working really, really hard to bring a new generation of scholars. This is a priority one. If you don't have a new generation of youthful scholars interested, engaged in Fitzgerald's work, then these societies will soon disappear by themselves.
Yeah. And also the natural tension in these societies, too, a little inside baseball, especially with Fitzgerald and Hemingway, the fans, who are legitimate fans of their work, and the scholars. And you need both for societies like this to function. A lot of you are fans of The Great Gatsby or F. Scott Fitzgerald. You're not necessarily scholars of F. Scott Fitzgerald. We need both sectors in order to function. And so both sets providing something positive to the society is what allows us to do the work we do.
No, I honestly don't think of anything to add to that. That was perfectly well put. We need each other, and if there is an appetite for beyond just the novels or the short stories, then I suppose the society can help provide that. And then obviously we need an audience for our books. But then also that kind of complicates the landscape of the scholars' work, because there are all sorts of exciting and new things happening all the time. Graphic novel adaptations of Gatsby or theatre versions of Gatsby, where the audience can actually be on the stage with the audience. So that kind of widens and deepens and complicates the terrain that we have to scrutinise.
Yes, okay. I just have a final question for you, Dave. So why? This has been bugging me all night. Why did they go up to Duluth to take a steamer to Buffalo? Why didn't they simply take the train? That's Fitzgerald and his mother, right?
Yeah, and sister.
And sister.
And I wrote a letter to his sister many years ago when she was still alive, Annabelle, and I asked the same question. And she said that they were up in Duluth visiting someone, but also I think it might have been easier to take the train to Duluth and the steamer that went right to Buffalo from Duluth. So I think there were two reasons. They were visiting someone there. I never could find out who it was, and it was easy.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasure.
I'll try not to have feedback here. Thank you all, both. Thank all four of you so very, very, very much for this presentation. It was a wonderful way to kick off Gatsby at 100. I think we hit on both the scholarship and the fandom. So yes. Thank you for that. Thank you again, all of you, for being here. Those of you watching online, please do, again, pick up a calendar. Next up in February, we have a one-person presentation of The Great Gatsby performed by Literature to Life at the George Latimer Central Library. There are copies of F. Scott Fitzgerald, A Composite Biography for sale. I am sure contributors and editors would be happy to sign those if you are interested. There are also copies of F. Scott Fitzgerald in Minnesota, and you can dive into that for all of those details like steamers versus trains and delve into some more of the Fitzgerald in St. Paul. Thank you again. And there are some more refreshments. Please enjoy yourselves. Have a wonderful rest of your day.